Lately, as a result of rewatching and reflecting on some of Jonathan Glazer's films, I've been thinking about the narrative use of sound in film. Sound is obviously an essential aspect of the immersiveness of a film, but sound can also be used as a narrative device that adds a contextual layer to the story. I think at its best it bypasses conventional modes of storytelling and directly evokes an internal response from you and feeds the tone and atmosphere of the film to effectively instill something in you without waving it in your face or having a character heavy-handedly blurt it out.
I don't know anything! I don't know anything!
This is why I would separate the use of sound in film into three categories, and I'm going to use some of Jonathan Glazer's films to give examples of those. So these three categories are roughly immersive, contextual, and experiential use of sound in film. By the way, I just separated these based on what I thought, so if you have your own ideas, I'd love to hear them, or if you know of an existing similar categorization of the use of sound in film, I'd also love to hear that.
Show me what you got!
So what I'm referring to in the first category, so the immersive use of sound in film, is that which goes most unnoticed. It's essentially the emphasis of sounds occurring in that specific scene, which essentially means the diegetic sound, so the dialogue that the characters are having, and the sounds resulting from the action in that specific scene and that kind of thing. The sound world of the film, essentially.
Did you hear that?
In post-production, that means the use of Foley and pre-recorded sounds to further accentuate and expand on the field recordings that you made that day when shooting, so that you have a fuller soundscape. And that essentially, well, contributes to the immersiveness of the film, but doesn't necessarily add a narrative layer to the scene or to the film, because it supports the narrative that already exists within the scene. This kind of sound design and use of sound is probably what you're most familiar with, so I don't really need to use a specific example of Jonathan Glazer's films for it, because this is what you hear in the vast majority of films. This is the most predominant use of sound design and sound in film. So this is kind of the most fundamental category.
What was that noise?
What I'm referring to in the second category, so the contextual use of sound in film, is not necessarily responding to something depicted on screen, and it also adds a narrative layer to the film. The best recent example I can think of is Jonathan Glazer's The Zone of Interest. If you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend it. It's one of the first films I've seen in a long time that had me convinced as soon as I left the cinema that I had seen something great, which unfortunately doesn't happen very often. It's a heavy film that addresses the atrocities of the Holocaust in a way that's different to how I've seen it done before. It's a very cold, dry, and sobering portrayal of the family life of the concentration camp commandant of Auschwitz. Instead of directly showing you the atrocities committed, you experience the indicators of the horrors from the family home that neighbors the concentration camp.
Genocide becomes ambient to their life.
Amongst all of the visual and narrative tools that are directly or indirectly alluding to the horrific acts occurring in such close proximity, the sound design is quite distinctly and clearly communicating what's happening behind that property wall.
We created a library of sound that took many months. Prisoner and guard interactions, executions.
As such, the sound design colors the scenes that it is used in. A scene in which kids are playing in their room suddenly becomes harrowing when you can hear the sounds of suffering happening only 50 meters away from them.
It could be a good sound or a bad sound. Is that the children I'm hearing, or does that come from over the wall?
In this case, the sound is adding a narrative layer that modifies the context of the scene. It's not merely emphasizing something that you see within the scene, it is contextualizing and influencing your interpretation of that which you see. This is a really powerful use of sound design, and you can see why the film and its sound designer Johnnie Burn got so much recognition for it. The sound is positioned as a secondary aspect of the storytelling, but it's providing crucial context to the narrative of the film. The film is also available to watch on Mubi at the moment if you have access to that, and it's available in your country.
I'm looking for a Sprite sponsorship.
Don't have Sprite. Now get outside.
Somebody in this building knows a Sprite rep. I know it. I know it.
In the third category, which I'm referring to as experiential sound, it doesn't necessarily need to juxtapose or complement the existing narrative. It almost becomes the narrative, or at least a very significant part of it. You might be familiar with this phrase that sound makes up half of your experience of a film, being an audio-visual medium. Well, in this use of sound, it seems that the sound is able to create a synergetic effect with the visual material to such a degree that it almost outweighs the visual material in its effectiveness of my experience of the film. This kind of occurred to me when I was trying to understand why I was so impressed by The Fall, which is one of Jonathan Glazer's short films from 2019, which is also available to watch on Mubi, by the way, but I'm not sponsored.
Hey, you already said that.
The Fall jumps out to me because it's such an adept use of sound design and music in a film. It combines these abstract musical elements with nuanced sound design that creates this full and gripping sound experience. And this is from the get-go. You have a crowd screaming in some indiscernible language or just random noises that are just primitively fear-inducing. You're instantly forced into a state of tension. It's also a really interesting dichotomy of sound because it's literally screaming at you, but also not explaining anything to you. By which I mean it's directly evoking an internal response out of you without giving you any context for what's happening. In fact, it's probably that lack of context and information that contributes greatly to your experience of it. This seems like it might be more of a directorial or editorial choice, but it's just as crucial in allowing the sound to be given the space to be effective, which really works because the sound doesn't feel like it's trying to tell you why the scene is horrible. It feels like it is part of the horror.
The guy asked for something spooky.
You see, with less appropriate sound design or music, you could take a lot of the weight out of these scenes. But because the existing soundscape is so integral to the experience of the film, it's as narratively essential as any of the action being depicted on screen. Obviously, this isn't always going to make sense for every project, but for ones where it does, and a gifted sound designer and composer can find the right moments and pockets for it, it's hard to imagine the piece without it. Naturally, the categories I mentioned are most effective when used in combination to create the most rounded experience of the film's creative vision.
That's how you do it. That's how you do it.
Just while we're still on The Fall, I wonder if fear and terror are more primally accessible through sound than other responses. So, say, happiness or sadness, I think it's harder to get that response through sound design. Okay, through music, obviously it's easier, but through non-musical or atonal sounds, I think it's harder to evoke that response. Whereas a gifted sound designer, I think, can easily create sounds that can unsettle you. Let me know your thoughts on that.
Okay.
But just to finish up on those two films, so The Fall and The Zone of Interest, I do think it's interesting that even though both films deal with similar themes of, oppression, hate, and conflict, they do so in very different ways. The Fall is so experiential and abstract, whereas The Zone of Interest is the exact opposite and very sober and grounded in reality. I just think it's really interesting that they came from the same director and yet have such opposite approaches. And in thinking about which is more effective, I don't think you can really determine that because they communicate such different things. The Fall sort of communicates that primal, awful, terrible, intense experience of those themes. And then The Zone of Interest gives you this cold, calculated, sober look from a sort of indirect perspective. And I think they're both incredibly effective. That's, I guess, their common thread.
What are you talking about?
So I'd be curious to know your thoughts on that as well. But in any case, thanks for listening and see you soon.